In the summer of 2007, a disappearance occurred that would grip the entire world. 3-year-old Madeleine McCann evaporated strangely from her hotel bedroom, even though her 2 younger siblings, a pair of twins, were also sleeping right there in the room, completely unharmed. Extensive searches were launched, but the question remains, was she snatched by a stranger, or was she the victim of a much darker plot? It is a mystery that has baffled investigators for over a decade. Before we dive into the chilling details of this century's most perplexing case, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss a single clue in our journey for the truth. The decision to leave the children sleeping alone was not a sudden impulse. It was a calculated risk, a bargain made with proximity and the illusion of safety. The adults sat at the table in the tapas restaurant, their voices carrying over the short distance to the apartment block. It felt secure. It felt close. To the parents, the apartment was not a distant location, but merely an extension of the dining area, separated only by a swimming pool and a pathway. They believed they were in control. They believed that by checking every 20 minutes, they were creating a safety net through which nothing could slip. They were wrong. Kate sat at the table, but her mind was tethered to apartment 5A. It was a physical sensation, a pull that tugged at her even as she laughed at a joke or took a sip of wine. The group, 7 friends in total, had established a rhythm. One would leave, walk the path, listen, and return. It was a relay race of vigilance. The first check had been performed by Matt. He had returned with a casual assurance. Silence, peace. The children were sleeping. The illusion of safety was reinforced. 20 minutes later, it was Jerry's turn. He stood up from the table. The time was roughly 5 minutes past 9 o'clock. He walked the route that would soon become etched into his memory, a path of regret and endless questions. He did not look at the sky or the trees. He focused on the destination. He climbed the small steps to the rear patio. The night was quiet, but it was not empty. Jerry reached the patio doors. They were sliding doors, left unlocked for this very purpose, to allow them to enter and exit without the noise of keys or the hassle of walking around to the front. He slid the door open and stepped into the living area. He paused. He listened. The silence of the apartment was heavy, the kind of silence that usually signifies deep sleep. He walked towards the bedroom door. He stopped. The door was open. Not fully, but wide enough to see into the room. This triggered a small, sharp spike of confusion in his chest. They always left the door slightly ajar, but not this wide. Had Matt opened it? Had a draft pushed it? He stepped closer. He peered into the gloom of the bedroom. He saw the shapes of his children. Madeleine was there, on the bed, lying on her side. The twins were in their travel cots. The relief was instantaneous, washing away the confusion. They were safe. He took a step into the room to be sure. He looked at Madeleine. She appeared sound asleep, her breathing rhythmic. He felt a surge of love, a desire to protect this peace. Then he noticed the window. The curtains were blowing slightly. The shutters, which should have been wound down tight against the night, were raised. The window itself was open. This was the second anomaly. The door was wide. The window was open. His logical mind scrambled for an explanation. Kate must have opened it, he thought. Or perhaps he had done it earlier and forgotten. He did not think of an intruder. He did not think of a predator. The concept was too alien, too horrific to grasp in that mundane moment. He walked to the window and closed it. He lowered the shutters. He walked back to the bedroom door and pulled it until it was only slightly ajar, restoring the room to the state it should have been in. He felt a sense of order returning. He left the apartment. As he walked back towards the restaurant, he encountered a man named Jeremy, a fellow tourist he had played tennis with. They stopped on the path. They stood there, 2 fathers in a holiday resort, talking about the day, about the game, about the pleasantries of life. They stood in the pool of light from the street lamps. While they spoke, Jerry had his back to the apartment. He did not see the shadows shift. He did not hear the footsteps that might have been crunching on the gravel nearby. He stood in the immediate present, oblivious to the fact that the timeline of his life was fracturing. He was standing guard. Yet he was looking the wrong way. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but in the economy of a crime, minutes are a lifetime. Jerry returned to the table. He sat down. He told Kate that the children were fine. He mentioned the open door and the window, framing it as a curiosity rather than a threat. Kate nodded. She accepted the information. If Jerry said it was fine, it was fine. The dinner continued. The laughter resumed. The clock ticked forward. The next check was Kate's responsibility. It was now 10 o'clock. The air had grown cooler. Kate stood up. She felt a sudden wave of fatigue, the exhaustion of the holiday, catching up with her. She smoothed her dress and began the walk. She walked the same stones Jerry had walked. She climbed the same steps. She reached the patio doors. She entered the apartment. The silence hit her differently this time. It was not the heavy silence of sleep. It was a hollow silence. A vacuum. It felt wrong. Her maternal instinct, sharper and more primal than any logic, flared like a warning flare. She noticed the door. It was open wide again, just as Jerry had found it, but Jerry had closed it. The wind? She walked towards it. The draft slammed the door shut in her face. The violence of the sound made her jump. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. She reached out, her hand trembling, and pushed the door open. She looked at the bed. She saw the pillow. She saw the blanket thrown back. She saw the soft toy, the cat doll Madeleine never slept without. It was sitting there, high on the bed, near the pillow. But the space where her daughter should have been was empty. Kate blinked. Her mind rejected the image. She looked at the travel cots. The twins were there, sleeping soundly. She looked back at the bed. Empty. Madeleine? She whispered. The name died in the room, absorbed by the walls. She checked the parents' bedroom. Empty. She checked the bathroom. Empty. She checked the wardrobe. Empty. She ran back to the children's room. She looked at the window. It was open. The shutters were raised all the way up. The window she knew Jerry had closed. The realization did not come as a thought. It came as a physical blow. It was a punch to the gut that stole her breath. The open window, the open door, the empty bed, the silence, the safety net had failed. The proximity was a lie. She did not scream yet. She ran. She ran out of the apartment, her feet flying over the ground that now felt dangerous, hostile. She ran towards the light of the restaurant, towards the faces of her friends who were still smiling, still unaware. As she got closer, she saw their faces turn towards her. They saw her expression. The terror on her face was a mask of pure agony. The smile vanished from Jerry's face. He stood up, knocking his chair back. Kate reached the table. Her lungs finally found the air they needed. She did not cry. She did not sob. She delivered the news with the force of a thunderclap. "Madeleine is gone," she screamed. "Someone has taken her." The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second, suspended in the disbelief of the listeners. Then, chaos erupted. The table was abandoned. Chairs were overturned. The peaceful dinner was over. The nightmare had begun. The scream that Kate released did not just break the silence, it shattered the reality of the evening. It was a sound that triggered a primal instinct in everyone who heard it. The reaction at the table was immediate. There was no hesitation, no moment of processing. Jerry was the first to move. He did not run. He sprinted, his body propelled by a surge of adrenaline that erased the fatigue of the day and the effects of the wine. The distance between the restaurant and the apartment, which had felt so short and safe moments ago, now stretched out like a terrifying gauntlet. He reached the patio doors seconds later. He did not stop to check the surroundings. He burst into the living area, his breathing harsh and ragged. He went straight to the children's bedroom. He needed to see it for himself. He needed his own eyes to confirm the impossible nightmare that Kate had announced. He entered the room. He saw the empty bed. He saw the cuddle cat toy. He saw the raised shutters. The visual confirmation struck him with physical force. He dropped to his knees, checking under the bed, checking the wardrobe, tearing through the small space with frantic, desperate energy. He shouted her name. His voice was loud, raw, bouncing off the walls of the small room. Madeleine. There was no answer. Only the sleeping sounds of the twins, who, remarkably, remained undisturbed by the chaos erupting around them. Jerry stood up. He ran back out to the patio. Kate was there, surrounded by their friends who had followed close behind. The group, the Tapa 7, was no longer a collection of holidaymakers. They were a mobilized unit of panic. The women moved to comfort Kate, who was trembling violently, her shock manifesting in physical tremors. The men immediately looked outward. "We need to search," someone shouted. "She might have wandered off. She might be just outside." They divided instantly. Matt and the others began to fan out. They ran to the swimming pool area first, driven by the terrifying thought of a child in the water. They scanned the dark surface. Nothing. They checked the bushes, the pathways, the tennis courts. They called her name over and over, their voices overlapping, creating a chorus of desperation that began to wake the rest of the resort. Jerry ran back to the reception. He needed help. He needed the police. He slammed his hand on the desk, demanding action. The receptionist, startled and confused, struggled to comprehend the severity of the situation. To the staff, a missing child usually meant a toddler who had walked a few yards away and was hiding. They did not understand the concept of taken. They did not understand that the window had been forced open. "Call the police," Jerry roared. "Get them here now." The protocol was slow. It was sluggish. The resort staff began their own search, moving with a lack of urgency that infuriated the parents. They walked with flashlights, checking the usual spots. They did not seal the exits. They did not lock down the perimeter. Back at apartment 5A, the scene was descending into anarchy. This was the beginning of the golden hour, the crucial first 60 minutes in any abduction case, where the trail is fresh and the perpetrator is likely still close. But instead of preservation, there was contamination. Friends ran in and out of the apartment. Neighbors, awakened by the noise, came to see what was happening. They walked through the front door. They walked through the patio door. They touched the handles. They leaned against the walls. They stood in the bedroom, looking at the empty bed. With every person who entered, a potential fingerprint was destroyed. With every footstep, a microscopic fiber was displaced. The crime scene was being trampled by well-meaning concern. Kate remained in the apartment for a while, paralyzed by the fear that if she left, Madeleine might come back and not find her. But the inaction was unbearable. She eventually joined the search, running through the streets of Praia da Luz. She ran towards the beach. The ocean, usually a source of beauty, now looked like a black void. She screamed her daughter's name into the wind. It took over an hour for the local police, the GNR, to arrive. When they did, they were 2 officers in a patrol car. They did not have crime scene tape. They did not have forensics kits. They walked into the apartment with heavy boots, smoking cigarettes. They looked at the bed. They looked at the parents. "She probably just walked away," one officer said, his tone dismissive. "She will be found in the morning." Jerry tried to explain about the shutters. He tried to explain that a 3-year-old child could not raise heavy shutters and climb out of a window on her own. He tried to explain the position of the cuddle cat. But the language barrier was a wall. The officers spoke little English. Jerry spoke no Portuguese. The translation was lost in the panic. The police did not treat it as a crime scene. They treated it as a domestic incident. They did not set up roadblocks. They did not call the border patrol. They did not check the cars leaving the village. The roads out of Praia da Luz remained wide open. A vehicle could have driven to the Spanish border in less than 2 hours. The perpetrator had an open highway and a massive head start. As the night deepened, the search expanded but lost focus. The resort manager initiated a missing child protocol, which involved staff checking the bins and the utility rooms. Guests from other apartments joined in. 60 people were now roaming the complex, calling the name. It was chaos. It was noise. But it was ineffective. Jerry ran the streets until his lungs burned. He checked under cars. He checked construction sites. He looked into the dark alleys where the streetlights did not reach. Every shadow looked like a person. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a child's footstep, but every investigation turned up nothing. At around 4 in the morning, the Specialized Criminal Investigation Police, the PJ, were finally notified. But by then, hours had passed. The golden hour was long gone. The timeline had bled out. The sun began to rise over the resort, casting a cruel light on the situation. The darkness had hidden the truth, but the light did not reveal it. Kate and Jerry sat in the apartment. The twins had been moved. The room was empty. The noise of the search had faded into a grim, exhausted silence. The adrenaline was crashing, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. They knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that this was not a simple case of a child wandering off. The window had been open. The bed was empty. The silence remained. The first night was over. The investigation had barely begun. And yet, it felt like they had already lost. The realization that they were now living in a world without their daughter began to take hold, a nightmare from which they could not wake up. The resort was waking up to a beautiful morning, but for the McCanns, the sun brought no warmth. It only illuminated the vast, terrifying emptiness where Madeleine used to be. The transition from the chaotic night to the first morning of the investigation was marked not by a change in atmosphere, but by a shift in authority. The local officers, who had stood smoking and shrugging in the darkness, finally stepped back. In their place came the Policia Judiciaria, the PJ. These men did not wear uniforms. They wore suits. They moved with a sharpness that had been entirely absent during the critical hours of the night. But for the parents, their arrival brought a new kind of dread. The realization that this was now officially a major crime scene, yet the crime scene had already been destroyed. The forensic team arrived late. They wore white protective suits that stood out starkly against the exhaustion of the family. They entered apartment 5A. They dusted for fingerprints on the patio doors, the shutters, and the frame of the window. The narrative of their movements was precise, but it was a performance of futility. Kate watched them, knowing that dozens of people, friends, resort staff, local police, had already touched those same surfaces. She watched them lift prints that likely belonged to the very people who were trying to help. The physical evidence, the silent story that the room could have told, had been overwritten by the noise of panic. The detectives began the interviews. They separated Kate and Jerry. The questions were not comforting. They were clinical. They asked about routines. They asked about timelines. They asked about the drinking at dinner. The language barrier remained a thick, suffocating wall. A translator was present, but the nuance of emotion, the desperate urgency of the parents, seemed to get lost in the exchange. When Jerry tried to emphasize the open window, the detectives exchanged glances. They seemed skeptical of a break-in. There was no shattered glass. There was no splintered wood. To the detectives, the lack of violence on the door frame suggested something else, something they did not voice yet, but which hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. While the forensic team worked inside, Jerry focused on the outside. His mind, rational and analytical by training, was trying to solve the logistical problem of the abduction. He asked the question that would haunt the investigation for years. Are the borders closed? The answer was vague. It was bureaucratic. The officers could not give a definitive yes. The reality was far more terrifying. The drive from Praia da Luz to the Spanish border took less than 2 hours. It was a straight shot, a fast highway. Between the time Kate discovered the empty bed and the time the PJ arrived, 6 hours had passed. 6 hours was enough time to cross the border 3 times over. It was enough time to reach an airport. It was enough time to vanish into the vast, open continent of Europe. Jerry realized then that the net had never been cast. The ring of steel, the immediate lockdown that should happen when a child is taken, had not materialized. The roads had remained open. The cars had flowed freely. The abductor had not been forced to hide. They had simply driven away. This realization ignited a new kind of panic in the father, a panic born of helplessness. The system that was supposed to protect them had failed to react. He stepped out of the apartment. He grabbed his phone. If the police could not close the world, he would have to open it. He began to call everyone. He called family back in England. He called friends. He called contacts who knew people in the media. The decision was made in those frantic moments. If the physical search had failed, they would launch a psychological one. They would make Madeleine the most famous face on the planet. They would make it impossible for the abductor to hide her, because the entire world would be looking. By midday, the character of the resort had changed completely. It was no longer a holiday destination. It was a siege. The first television crews began to arrive, their satellite trucks parking on the narrow streets. The lenses pointed not at the sea, but at the grieving couple. The journalists, hungry for a story, began to interview anyone who would speak. Inside the police station, the timeline was being constructed. The detectives focused heavily on the Tapa 7. They needed to verify the checks. They needed to know exactly who stood up, who walked back, and what they saw. The statements were taken, but the inconsistencies of memory began to show. One friend remembered the time as 9 o'clock. Another remembered it as 9:05. In a normal life, 5 minutes is nothing. In a criminal investigation, 5 minutes is the difference between guilt and innocence, between presence and absence. The police questioned Jane Tanner, one of the friends. She offered a piece of information that stopped the room. She claimed that during her check, earlier in the evening, she had seen a man. He was walking away from the apartment block. He was carrying a child. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. It was a resort. Parents carried sleeping children all the time. But now, in the harsh light of the abduction, the memory took on a sinister shape. She described the man. She described the child's pajamas. The detectives listened. This was the first physical lead. A man in the shadows, a child in his arms. It fitted the timeline. It fitted the location, but even as they wrote down her statement, the clock continued to tick. The leads were hours old. The trail was cold. The dogs were brought in again, sniffing the air. But the scent of the child was everywhere and nowhere. Kate and Jerry returned to the apartment only to collect essential items. They could not sleep there. The sight of the empty bed was a physical assault on their minds. They moved to a different room in the resort, but they did not sleep. They sat, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for a ransom demand, waiting for a police officer to walk in and say it was all a mistake. The phone did not ring. The ransom did not come. Instead, the sun began to set on the second night. The darkness returned, bringing with it the terrifying knowledge that their daughter was spending another night alone, somewhere out there in the vast, indifferent world. The parents stood on the balcony of their new room, looking out at the black ocean. They were no longer just victims. They were becoming players in a global game of information. They had to fight the police's incompetence, the media's intrusion, and the abductor's silence. The battle had shifted. It was no longer a search for a lost child in a village. It was a war against time itself. And as the second night closed in, they knew they were losing. The investigation now turned inward, moving from the physical search of the ground to the fragile, treacherous landscape of human memory. The detectives knew that in the absence of forensic evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers, the only truth left resided in the minds of the people who had been there. They needed to reconstruct the night of the 3rd of May, minute by minute, shadow by shadow. They needed witnesses. Jane Tanner, one of the friends dining at the tapas bar, became the focal point of this new line of inquiry. She sat in the interview room, the pressure of the situation weighing heavily on her. She had a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of memory that she had initially dismissed as irrelevant, but which now burned with terrifying significance. She told the detectives that she had left the table earlier in the evening, around 9:15, to check on her own child. As she walked up the road, passing the apartment block where the McCanns were staying, she saw a man. He was crossing the top of the road. He was walking away from the apartment, heading into the darkness of the surrounding streets. He was carrying a child. At the time, Jane had registered the image, but not the danger. In a holiday resort, a parent carrying a sleeping child back to their room is a common sight. It happens 100 times a night. She had not stopped him. She had not questioned him. She had simply walked past, her mind focused on her own task. But now, under the harsh lights of the police station, she replayed that moment. She described the man as wearing dark clothing. She described the child as wearing pajamas that matched the description of the ones Madeleine was wearing, pink and white. The child was hanging limp in the deep, heavy sleep of the unconscious. The police seized upon this statement. It gave them a timeline. If Jane was correct, the abduction had taken place at 9:15. This was during the window between Jerry's check and the next check. It meant the abductor had been brazen, walking through the streets while people were dining nearby. It meant he had slipped through the net by mere minutes. This sighting became the anchor of the early investigation. Sketches were drawn. The image of a man carrying a child became the face of the enemy. However, as the police built their theory around Jane Tanner, another narrative began to emerge. One that would complicate the picture and create a haunting duality. A separate family, the Smiths, who were Irish tourists holidaying in the same village, came forward with their own account. They had not been dining at the tapas bar. They had been walking home after a night out. Their timeline was different. They were walking through the streets around 10 o'clock, almost 45 minutes after Jane Tanner saw her mystery man. The Smiths described seeing a man walking down a street that led towards the beach and the ocean. He, too, was carrying a child. But their description of the man did not match the figure Jane Tanner had seen. The man the Smiths saw did not look like a tourist. He did not look like a parent taking a child to bed. He looked uncomfortable. He looked out of place. The child he was carrying was also in a deep sleep, her head resting against his shoulder, her bare feet dangling. The Smiths noted that the man did not seem to be comforting the child. He seemed to be transporting her. He walked with a purpose that made them uneasy, though they, like Jane, did not intervene at the time. They assumed, as we all do to protect our own sanity, that there was a logical, innocent explanation. The detectives were now faced with two phantom figures, the Tanner man and the Smith man. If the Tanner sighting was the abduction, then Madeleine was taken at 9:15. But if the Smith sighting was the abduction, then she was taken closer to 10 o'clock, right around the time Kate McCann discovered the empty bed. The discrepancy was paralyzing. Could there have been two men? Was it a relay? Or was one of these sightings a tragic case of mistaken identity? The investigation began to fracture under the weight of these conflicting accounts. The police poured resources into finding the Tanner man, believing him to be the key. They spent precious days and weeks chasing this shadow. Years later, it would be revealed that the Tanner man was likely just an innocent British tourist carrying his own child home from the night creche. A horrible coincidence that derailed the investigation. That left the Smithman. The figure walking towards the sea. The figure seen at 10 o'clock. The narrative shifted to this darker possibility. If the Smith family was right, then the abductor had been in the apartment while Jerry was checking on the children. He might have been hiding in the shadows of the bedroom, holding his breath while the father stood over the cot. He might have waited until Jerry left, then taken the child and walked out into the night, passing the Smith family as he made his escape towards the water. The thought sent a chill through the team. It implied a level of coldness and calculation that was terrifying. It meant the abductor was not just an opportunist, but someone who could control their fear, someone who could walk past witnesses without breaking stride. The sketches of these men were released to the public. They were faceless, generic, and yet they terrified the world. They represented the everyman. They could be anyone. They could be the man sitting at the next table, the man walking on the beach, the man watching from a parked car. For the parents, these sightings were a double-edged sword. They offered proof that Madeleine had been taken, that she was seen alive outside the apartment, but they also brought a crushing wave of guilt. People had seen her. People had walked past her. If only one of them had stopped. If only one of them had asked, "Is that your child?" The outcome might have been different. As the days turned into weeks, the Smithman sketch remained the most viable lead, a ghost that refused to vanish. He became the symbol of the investigation's failure, a man who walked through a crowded village with a stolen child in his arms and simply disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but a sketch and a lifetime of questions. The police realized they were chasing smoke. The abductor had not just stolen a child. He had stolen the truth, leaving behind a maze of contradictions that would trap the investigation for decades. The vacuum left by the missing child was quickly filled by a noise so loud it drowned out the sound of the ocean. Praia da Luz, once a sleepy collection of white villas and cobbled streets, was transformed overnight into a global theater. The media arrived not in ones or twos, but in battalions. Satellite trucks blocked the narrow roads. Cameras were pointed at every window, every balcony, every face that looked even remotely stricken with grief. The pressure in the air changed. It was no longer just a search for a lost girl. It was a demand for answers, and the demand was becoming aggressive. The Portuguese police, the PJ, felt the heat of this spotlight more than anyone. They were used to local crimes, to investigations that unfolded in the quiet shadows of bureaucracy. Now, they had the Prime Minister of Britain calling. They had the eyes of the world watching their every move. They needed a breakthrough. They needed a victory. And when a desperate system needs a culprit, it often looks for the most convenient face in the crowd. That face belonged to Robert Murat. He was a British expatriate, living in the village with his mother. His house, Casa Liliana, sat just 150 yards from apartment 5A. It was close, too close for the comfort of the detectives. But it was not just his proximity that drew their attention. It was his behavior. In the chaotic days following the disappearance, Murat had been present. He had been helpful. He spoke fluent Portuguese and English, and he had stepped forward to act as a translator for the journalists and the police. To a rational mind, this was the act of a concerned citizen trying to bridge the gap in a crisis. To the cynical mind of a detective under pressure, it looked like insertion. Why was he so involved? Why was he asking so many questions? Was he trying to help the investigation, or was he trying to monitor it? The line between altruism and narcissism is thin, and the police decided he had crossed it. The Whisper campaign began before the raid. Journalists, hungry for a villain to replace the faceless Smithman, began to circulate his name. The narrative shifted. They stopped looking for a stranger in the dark and started looking at the neighbor across the fence. Then came the action. Early one morning, the police descended on Casa Liliana. It was not a polite knock on the door. It was a swarm. Officers in uniforms and plain clothes flooded the property. They cordoned off the street, pushing the cameras back but not far enough to stop the world from witnessing the spectacle. Murat was taken in for questioning. He was named an arguido, a formal suspect. It was a legal status unique to the Portuguese system, one that offered certain protections but carried a heavy stigma. To the public watching on their televisions, arguido sounded like guilty. Inside the station, the interrogation was grueling. They hammered him on his movements. They asked him why he was there that night. They asked him about his life, his history, his thoughts. They stripped his privacy away layer by layer, looking for the monster they hoped was hiding beneath the ordinary exterior. Meanwhile, back at Casa Liliana, the search was physical and invasive. The police brought in sniffer dogs. They drained the swimming pool, the water receding to reveal nothing but blue tiles. They dug up the garden. They tore through the house, searching computers, hard drives, and personal letters. They were looking for a trophy, a photo, a piece of clothing, anything that would link him to Madeleine. The media frenzy reached a fever pitch. Reports were filed claiming a breakthrough was imminent. The world waited for the police to march him out in handcuffs, holding the evidence that would solve the mystery. The narrative was written. The strange loner, the helpful neighbor, the wolf in sheep's clothing. It was a perfect story. But stories require an ending, and this one dissolved into nothing. The pool was empty. The garden yielded only earth. The computers were clean. The interrogation, despite its intensity, produced no confession because there was nothing to confess. Murat maintained his innocence with a stamina that frustrated his accusers. He had been at home with his mother. He had been nowhere near the window. He had tried to help because he cared, not because he was guilty. After hours of searching and days of speculation, the police had to face a crushing reality. They had nothing. The raid, which was supposed to be the turning point, was a dead end. They had destroyed a man's reputation, turned his life upside down, and fed him to the wolves of the press, all based on intuition rather than evidence. Murat was released. He walked out of the station, but he did not walk out into freedom. He walked out into a prison of public opinion that would take years to dismantle. He eventually sued the newspapers that had labeled him a predator and won massive damages, but the money could not erase the images of the police digging up his flower beds. For Kate and Jerry, the collapse of the Murat theory was a double blow. First, it meant that an innocent man had been persecuted, adding another layer of tragedy to the saga. Second, and more terrifyingly, it meant that the police were back to zero. The golden hour was gone. The Tanner man was a ghost. The Smith man was a sketch. And the prime suspect was a mistake. The investigation was flailing. The energy that had been directed at Murat now had nowhere to go. It swirled in the air, toxic and restless. And slowly, inevitably, the gaze of the detectives began to turn. If the abductor wasn't the stranger, and it wasn't the neighbor, then who was left? The police looked back at the apartment. They looked back at the parents. The empathy that had defined the early days began to curdle into suspicion. The eye of the storm had passed over Robert Murat, and now it was moving towards Kate and Jerry. The hunt for a kidnapper was about to mutate into a hunt for a killer, and the parents were about to find themselves standing in the crosshairs of the very people they had begged for help. The investigation had hit a wall of silence. The leads had evaporated. The sightings were contradictory. The prime suspect had been cleared. In the absence of a visible path, the detectives decided to look for the invisible. They turned to a tool that relied not on human testimony, which could be flawed or manipulated, but on a biological instinct that was absolute. They called in the elite. 2 English Springer Spaniels arrived in Praia da Luz. They were not ordinary police dogs. They were highly specialized instruments of forensic science. One was trained to detect specific forensic traces, even if the area had been scrubbed clean or if time had passed. The other was trained to detect the specific scent associated with human remains. They were the best in their field, having worked on high-profile cases across the world, including FBI investigations. Their arrival marked a seismic shift in the strategy of the Polícia Judiciária. The dogs were brought to apartment 5A. The parents were not present. The apartment had been sealed, unsealed, rented to new tourists, and then sealed again. It was a compromised environment. Yet, the handlers were confident. If the scent was there, the dogs would find it. The process was recorded on video. The handler led the first dog, the victim recovery dog, into the apartment. The animal worked with a frantic, focused energy, its nose skimming the floor tiles, the furniture, the curtains. For minutes, there was nothing. The dog moved through the living area, the kitchen, the parents' bedroom. Then, the dynamic changed. When the dog entered the living room, near the area where the sofa stood and the wardrobe was positioned, its body language altered. It became agitated. It circled. It sniffed intensely at a specific spot on the floor and behind the sofa. Then, it barked. It was an alert. To the police watching the monitor, the bark was a thunderclap. The dog was signaling the scent of a cadaver. The second dog, the blood detection dog, was brought in separately. It did not know where the first dog had alerted. It worked the room blindly. Yet, when it reached the same area behind the sofa and near the curtains, it froze. It signaled. 2 different dogs, trained for 2 different scents, had alerted to the same specific locations in the apartment. The implication was devastating. The theory of abduction relied on the child being taken alive, or at least removed immediately. But the dogs were suggesting that a fatal incident might have occurred inside the apartment, or that the victim had been kept there. The investigation moved from the apartment to the vehicles. This was the critical test. The McCanns had rented a Renault Scenic several weeks after the disappearance to help with their daily movements. If the child had been abducted on the 3rd of May, there should be no scent of her in a car rented weeks later. The dogs were run past a line of cars. They ignored the neighbors' cars. They ignored the police cars. But when the cadaver dog reached the Renault Scenic rented by the parents, it stopped. It circled. It barked. The police officers exchanged looks that signified the end of empathy. In their minds, the narrative flipped instantly. The abduction theory collapsed. A new, darker theory took its place. They hypothesized that a tragedy had occurred in the apartment, possibly an accident, and that the parents, in a state of panic, had concealed the evidence and later used the rental car to move it to a final burial site. It was a theory of monstrous proportions. It required the parents to be actors of Oscar-winning caliber, grieving in public while coordinating a cover-up in private. It required them to move a body while the world's media was camped on their doorstep. The forensic samples from the spots where the dogs alerted were collected. Scraps of carpet, swabs from the car boot, fibers from the sofa. They were sent to a laboratory in Birmingham, England, for DNA analysis. The police waited for the science to confirm what the dogs had told them. They believed they were about to arrest the parents for homicide. However, science is rarely as binary as a dog's bark. When the results came back from the lab, they were inconclusive. The DNA was too degraded, too mixed. It could belong to the child, but it could also belong to her siblings or to the parents due to the shared genetic markers. It was not the smoking gun the police needed, but the damage was done. The trust between the parents and the police was shattered. Kate and Jerry, who had been pushing for the dogs to be brought in to help find their daughter, now felt betrayed by the very resource they had requested. They argued that the scent could have been transferred on toys or clothing. They argued that the car had been used to transport the twins' dirty nappies and trash, which could confuse the dogs. The police did not listen. They stopped looking for a kidnapper. They stopped searching the borders. They focused entirely on the couple. The turning tide had washed away the image of the grieving victims and replaced it with the image of cold, calculating suspects. The investigation had turned cannibalistic. It was now feeding on the people it was supposed to serve. The parents were no longer fighting to find their daughter. They were fighting to stay out of prison. The summons came in early September. The summer heat was beginning to fade, but the temperature inside the investigation was reaching a boiling point. Kate and Jerry were called back to the police station in Portimao. This time, there was no pretense of a partnership. The detectives were not asking for help. They were demanding answers. The atmosphere had shifted from cooperative to adversarial. The parents were about to cross a threshold from which there is often no return. The transition from victim to suspect. Kate was taken into the interview room first. The space was small, airless, and designed to break the spirit. She sat across from the detectives who had spent the last few months smiling at her. Men who were now looking at her with cold, professional detachment. The questioning began in the morning and stretched into the afternoon, a marathon of repetition and accusation. They asked her about the timeline again. They asked her about the children's sleep patterns. But then, the questions changed. They stopped asking who took her and started asking how did she die. The detective leaned forward. He placed a proposition on the table, a deal that was as shocking as it was calculated. He told Kate that the police knew Madeleine had died in the apartment. He told her they had DNA evidence to prove it. He told her that if she confessed, if she admitted that it was an accident, a terrible mistake involving medication or a fall, and that she and Jerry had panicked and hidden the body, the court would be lenient. 2 years, he said. Or maybe less. You could be home soon. It was a trap baited with the promise of freedom, but it required her to destroy the truth. The police were offering her a lifeline out of a murder charge, but only if she agreed to their narrative. They wanted to close the case. They wanted a solution that fit the dog alerts and the lack of a kidnapping trail. Kate stared at him. The sheer absurdity of the offer left her breathless. To accept the deal would mean admitting to a crime she did not commit. More importantly, it would mean stopping the search for her daughter. If she confessed to hiding a body that did not exist, no one would ever look for the living child again. She refused. She refused with a quiet, shaking intensity. She told them she would not lie. Not for a lighter sentence, not to save herself. She told them Madeleine was missing, not dead. The interrogation continued for 11 hours. They pushed her. They twisted her words. They tried to make her doubt her own memory, but she held the line. When she finally emerged from the room, she was exhausted, hollowed out, but unbroken. Then it was Jerry's turn. The detectives used a different tactic with him. They appealed to his logic, his intellect. They laid out the evidence, the dogs, the car, the inconsistencies in the statements of the Tapas 7. They tried to convince him that the game was up, that the science had caught them. They suggested that perhaps Kate was responsible and he was protecting her, or vice versa. They tried to drive a wedge between the couple, hoping one would crack to save the other. Jerry, like Kate, refused to play their game. He analyzed their questions and realized they had no body, no weapon, and no witnesses. They had a theory and a dog's bark. He maintained his innocence with a steely resolve. He challenged their timeline. He challenged their logic. By the end of the long, grueling day, the police played their final card. They formally named Kate and Jerry McCann as arguidos. The word arguido has no direct translation in English law, but it sits somewhere between suspect and accused. It meant they were no longer witnesses. It meant they had the right to remain silent. But it also meant the police could restrict their movements. It meant the world would now look at them not as the grieving parents of a stolen child, but as the prime suspects in her disappearance. When they walked out of the police station that night, the world had changed. The flashbulbs that popped in their faces were no longer illuminating their pain, they were blinding them with suspicion. The crowd of journalists shouted questions, not about the abductor, but about the confession. The drive back to their villa was silent. The weight of the status was crushing. They were trapped in a foreign country, fighting a legal system they did not understand. Accused of the worst crime imaginable, the investigation into the abduction of Madeleine had effectively stopped. The police were no longer looking for a man in the shadows. They were building a case against the mother and father. Yet, in the midst of this nightmare, there was a strange clarity. They knew they were innocent, and they knew that as long as the police were focused on them, the real perpetrator was getting away. The deal had been rejected, but the cost of that refusal was high. They were now alone, isolated on an island of suspicion, with the entire world watching to see if they would sink. The parents realized that to find their daughter, they would first have to prove they hadn't killed her. The formal investigation in Portugal had stalled, paralyzed by the standoff between the police and the parents. But nature abhors a vacuum, and the silence of the detectives was quickly filled by the roar of the world. The disappearance of the child ceased to be a local police matter and transformed into a global phenomenon. It became a story that consumed breakfast television, filled the front pages of newspapers, and dominated the early days of social media. The web of noise had begun to spin, and it was a chaotic, uncontrollable force. The parents, trapped in the eye of this hurricane, realized that if the police would not look for their daughter, they had to mobilize the public. They launched a campaign that was unprecedented in the history of missing person cases. The face of the child, the blonde hair, the distinctive mark in the right eye, was plastered across billboards, football stadiums, and embassy walls. Celebrities, politicians, and athletes joined the chorus. The Pope granted an audience. The Prime Minister of Britain sent diplomats. The entire planet seemed to be looking for one small girl. But visibility is a double-edged sword. With the awareness came the sightings. They came from everywhere. A tourist in Morocco claimed to have seen a blonde girl being carried by a woman in a burqa. A shopkeeper in Belgium reported a child who looked like her walking into a store. Sightings flooded in from Malta, from Spain, from South America. Each report was a spark of hope that flared brightly, and then was extinguished by the cold water of reality. The parents were forced to live on a roller coaster of adrenaline and despair. A phone call would come in. She has been seen. The heart would leap. The logistics would be scrambled. Private investigators would be dispatched. And then, hours or days later, the news would return. It was a mistake. It was a lookalike. It was a hoax. The worst of these were the malicious calls. The internet, still in its relative youth, but already showing its dark potential, became a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. Forums sprang up dedicated to dissecting every facial expression of the mother, every word of the father. Strangers who had never set foot in Portugal became experts, analyzing pixelated photographs and creating timelines that bore no resemblance to the facts. They accused the parents. They accused the friends. They invented scenarios of trafficking rings and government cover-ups. This noise did more than just hurt the family. It actively hampered the investigation. The police were inundated with thousands of tips, the vast majority of which were useless. The real leads, the quiet, subtle pieces of information that might have solved the case, were buried under mountains of well-meaning but irrelevant data. The detectives spent more time chasing ghosts in Marrakesh than looking for criminals in the Algarve. The campaign also created a strange paradox. The child was everywhere, yet she was nowhere. Her image was more recognizable than that of movie stars, yet her physical presence had vanished completely. The Find Madeleine Fund raised millions, but money could not buy the one thing they needed, a verified trace. As the months dragged into a year, the public's fascination began to curdle. The empathy that had defined the early weeks turned into fatigue, and then into suspicion. The media, which had built the parents up as tragic figures, began to tear them down. They criticized the mother for not crying enough. They criticized the father for being too controlled. They analyzed the way they held hands, the way they looked at each other. The court of public opinion was in session, and it did not require evidence to deliver a verdict. The parents traveled to Washington. They traveled to Brussels. They pushed for better systems to track missing children across borders. They became lobbyists for a cause they never wanted to join. They channeled their grief into action, trying to change the laws of Europe so that no other family would face the bureaucratic walls they had encountered. But every meeting, every interview, every flight was shadowed by the knowledge that they were moving further away from the night of the 3rd of May. The timeline was stretching. The memories were fading. The abductor, whoever they were, had slipped into the background, shielded by the very chaos the case had generated. The web of noise had succeeded in making the child famous, but it had failed to bring her home. It had created a legend, a symbol, a ghost story that the world told itself in the dark. But for the parents, sitting in their home in England, surrounded by the unopened toys and the untouched room, the fame was meaningless. They did not want a symbol. They did not want a campaign. They wanted the daughter who had been stolen from them, the child whose voice was being drowned out by the shouting of the world. The noise was deafening, but the silence of the empty room was louder still. Years dissolved into a decade. The investigation, once a raging fire, had cooled into embers. The files on the disappearance of Madeleine McCann sat on shelves in Portugal and the United Kingdom, gathering dust, reviewed occasionally by detectives who had inherited a mystery with no solution. The parents continued their vigil, but the world had largely moved on. Then, from the silence of a prison cell in Germany, a name emerged. It was not a name that had appeared in the early files. It was not a member of the Tapa 7. It was not a local resident like Robert Murat. It was a phantom who had been hiding in plain sight. Christian B. was a drifter. He was a man who lived on the fringes of society, existing in the spaces between legality and crime. In the spring of 2007, he was living in Praia da Luz. He was not staying in a hotel. He was not a tourist. He lived in a distinctive camper van, a vehicle painted white and yellow, a mobile shell that allowed him to move unnoticed through the Algarve. The breakthrough did not come from forensic science or a sudden confession to the police. It came from a conversation in a bar, years after the event. Christian B., consuming alcohol, began to speak to a friend. The television in the bar was showing a documentary about the McCann case, flashing the face of the missing girl on the screen. The friend commented on the tragedy, on the mystery of it all. Christian B. looked at the screen. He did not show empathy. He showed knowledge. He leaned in and whispered a sentence that would eventually travel across borders and reignite the entire investigation. "I know all about that," he said. She did not scream. The friend, chilled by the statement, did not go to the police immediately. In the criminal underworld, silence is currency, and speaking to authorities is a dangerous debt. But the words festered. Years later, when Christian B. was incarcerated for other serious crimes involving drugs and theft, the friend finally spoke. The tip was passed to the German authorities, then to the British, and finally to the Portuguese. The detectives began to build a profile of this new suspect. It was a terrifying match. Christian B. was a criminal who targeted holiday resorts. He did not see the villas of Praia da Luz as homes. He saw them as targets. He was a burglar who knew how to force windows, how to move silently through darkened rooms while families slept. He survived by stealing cash, electronics, and passports, but his criminal history contained darker chapters, convictions for serious offenses that suggested he was capable of far more than theft. The investigation reconstructed his life in 2007. They found that he was living a transient existence, surviving on the proceeds of crime. He worked sporadic jobs, repairing cars, stealing diesel. He was a man with no fixed anchor, which made him the perfect suspect for a disappearance that had left no trace. If anyone knew how to vanish, it was him. What chilled the investigators most was his vehicle. The white and yellow camper van was not just a mode of transport, it was a hiding place. It could be parked on a cliff edge one night and deep in a forest the next. It offered privacy in public spaces. Witnesses from the time, whose statements had been filed away and forgotten, suddenly made sense. People had reported seeing a van matching that description parked near the Ocean Club in the days leading up to the abduction. They had seen a man watching the apartment block. At the time, they thought he was just a traveler. Now, they realized he might have been hunting. The profile of Christian B. solved the logistical problems that had plagued the case. He had the means. The van. He had the motive. A history of deviant behavior. He had the opportunity. He was living mere miles from the resort. Unlike the parents, who were trapped in the spotlight, Christian B. was a ghost. He could move in the shadows. He could cross borders without raising an eyebrow. The German police, the BKA, took the lead. They did not treat this as a cold case. They treated it as an active homicide investigation. They dug into his past. They found letters, hard drives, and old phone numbers. They began to piece together a map of his movements that placed him dangerously close to apartment 5A. Christian B., sitting in his prison cell for an unrelated crime, remained silent. He refused to speak to the detectives. He knew that without a body, without a weapon, and without DNA, the case against him was circumstantial. He played the game of silence, a game he had mastered over a lifetime of evasion. But the police had one piece of evidence that he could not silence, a digital footprint that he had left behind on the night of the 3rd of May. It was a ghost signal, a connection made by a mobile phone that pinned him to the crime scene with the precision of a GPS coordinate. The man in the camper van thought he had erased his tracks, but he had forgotten that in the modern world, even shadows leave a digital echo. The hunt was no longer for a needle in a haystack. The police had found the needle. Now, they just had to prove it had drawn blood. The investigation into Christian B. hinged on a single, invisible thread, a digital handshake between a mobile phone and a cell tower. The German detectives, working with cold precision, had unearthed the telephone records from the night of the 3rd of May, 2007. In a sea of data, they found one specific connection that changed the gravity of the entire case. The record showed that the suspect's phone was active in the Praia da Luz area. It was not just in the village. It was pinging off a mast that covered the Ocean Club resort. The timing was the critical factor. The device received a call at 32 minutes past 7 in the evening. The conversation lasted for 30 minutes. This placed the suspect in the immediate vicinity of apartment 5, exactly 1 hour before the McCanns left their apartment to head to the tapas restaurant. This was not a fleeting signal. It was a sustained presence. The detectives analyzed the data. They identified the person on the other end of the line, a Portuguese national, but the content of that conversation remained a mystery. However, the location data was irrefutable. While the parents were bathing their children and reading bedtime stories, a man with a history of burglary and aggression was standing in the darkness just outside their perimeter, talking on a phone. The police theorized that this 30-minute window was the surveillance phase. The suspect was watching. He was waiting for the lights to go out or for the parents to leave. The phone call ended just as the night settled in. The silence that followed the termination of that call was terrifying to the investigators. It suggested that the suspect had finished his conversation and was now ready to work. This piece of evidence anchored the German investigation. It transformed Christian B. from a person of interest into the prime suspect. It placed him at the scene of the crime, at the time of the crime, with no alibi. The 30-minute window became the most scrutinized half-hour in criminal history, a period of time where a life was likely being measured and targeted by a predator waiting in the dark. 15 years after the disappearance, the search for physical evidence reignited with sudden, violent intensity. The German police received credible information that linked the suspect to a specific location: the Arade Dam Reservoir, a remote body of water located 30 miles from Praia da Luz. Christian B. had reportedly referred to this isolated spot as his little paradise. It was a place where he had camped often, a place where he felt safe, a place where he could hide things. In May of 2023, the police descended on the reservoir. This was not a cursory look, it was an excavation. Heavy machinery was brought in. Trees were cleared. The scrubland was flattened. Portuguese police, German investigators, and British officers stood together on the banks, watching as the earth was turned over. Divers entered the murky water. They were not looking for a living child. They were looking for fragments. They were looking for the pink pajamas. They were looking for a camera. They were searching for anything that could link the suspect to the victim. The operation lasted for days. The soil was sifted. Bags of material were carried away to be analyzed in laboratories. The public watched with a mixture of hope and dread. The sight of the police digging in the dirt is the ultimate symbol of a murder investigation. It is an admission that the hope for survival is gone, replaced by the need for justice. The investigators found items, strips of clothing, pieces of plastic, but they remained tight-lipped about their significance. The reservoir search was a gamble. It was an attempt to find a needle in a haystack decades after the needle had been dropped. Whether the dam held the secret or whether it was another dead end remained a question that only the forensic labs could answer. Just as the investigation seemed to be settling into a grim rhythm of forensic searches, a curveball emerged from the digital world. In February of 2023, a young woman created an Instagram account that exploded across the internet. Her name was Julia Wendell, and she was from Poland. Her claim was simple and explosive. "I am Madeleine McCann." Julia posted photographs comparing her face to the missing girl. She pointed to a specific defect in her right eye, a coloboma, which matched the distinctive mark that Madeleine had. She pointed to moles on her legs. She pointed to gaps in her own childhood memories and a lack of baby photos in her family albums. She claimed she had been mistreated in the past by a man who resembled the sketches of suspects in the McCann case. The internet reacted with hysteria. The account gained millions of followers in days. People analyzed the facial structures. They debated the eye defect. For a brief moment, the world allowed itself to believe in a miracle. Could it be true? Could the child have been stolen, raised in another country, and forgotten who she was until now? The pain this inflicted on the McCann family was immeasurable. They had faced hoaxes before, but this was different. This was a young woman who genuinely seemed to believe her own story. She was demanding a DNA test. She was appearing on American talk shows. The imposter narrative hijacked the real investigation. The focus shifted from the German suspect and the reservoir back to the question of identity. It was a distraction. But it was a distraction born of human desperation. The desperation of a girl who felt lost, and the desperation of a world that wanted a happy ending. The resolution to the Julia Wendell saga came not with a reunion, but with a laboratory report. Under intense global pressure, and with the help of a private investigator, Julia submitted her DNA for analysis. The world waited. The speculation reached a fever pitch. The results arrived in April. They were conclusive. They were absolute. Julia Wendell was 100% Polish. She had some Lithuanian and Romanian heritage, but she had zero British roots. She was not Madeleine McCann. The collapse of the claim was swift. The Instagram account was deleted. The media cycle moved on. But the tragedy remained. Julia was not a villain. She was a troubled young woman who had projected her own trauma onto the blank canvas of the world's most famous missing person case. She had looked in the mirror and wanted to be someone else. For Kate and Jerry, the result was a return to the status quo. It was the closing of another false door. It was a reminder that while the world could treat the case as a mystery to be solved online, for them, it was a daily reality of absence. The DNA test proved who Julia was not, but it brought them no closer to finding where their daughter was. It was a cruel episode that highlighted how the case had become a magnet for the broken and the hopeful, trapping everyone in a cycle of disappointment. With the German suspect under investigation and the imposter theory debunked, the narrative turned to the darkest possibility of all: the organized network. Detectives had long theorized that for a child to vanish so completely, without a body ever being found, professional help might have been involved. This chapter of the investigation focused on the dark web and the hidden roots of human trafficking. Europe has open borders. A car can travel from Portugal to Poland without being stopped. Investigators began to look at the logistics of moving a stolen child. They analyzed the routes used by criminal gangs. They looked at the possibility that Madeleine had been taken to order, stolen by a thief, and sold to a buyer. This theory explained the lack of forensic evidence at the scene. It explained the efficiency of the abduction. It explained why the face of the child, known to billions, had never been spotted. If she had been moved into a closed network, hidden in a private home, or transported to a different continent, the public search would have been useless. The unseen network is the most terrifying prospect because it implies a system. It implies that the abductor was not a lone wolf acting on impulse, but a cog in a machine. Police forces across Europe began to share data on trafficking rings, looking for intersections with the Praia da Luz timeline. They looked for other missing children, trying to find patterns. It was a search into the abyss, a recognition that there are parallel worlds operating beneath the surface of society, where people are commodities and silence is enforced by fear. We arrive at the present day. The room in apartment 5A is occupied by tourists who may not even know its history. The resort carries on. The sun still shines on the Algarve, but for the McCann family, time stopped on the 3rd of May, 2007. The investigation is technically still open. The German police are building their case against Christian B., hoping to find the one piece of physical evidence that will allow them to charge him. The British police continue to fund the inquiry, a testament to the promise that they will not give up until there is a resolution. Kate and Jerry McCann still buy presents for Madeleine on her birthday. They still keep her room ready. They live in the agonizing space between hope and grief. The empty room is not just a physical space, it is a metaphor for the case itself. It is a puzzle with a missing piece that renders the whole picture incomplete. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann remains the most heavily reported missing person case in modern history. It has changed how we parent. It has changed how we travel. It has changed how police investigate. But after thousands of witness statements, millions of pounds spent, and decades of searching, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Who took her? Where did they go? And is she, against all odds, still out there? The story does not have an ending. It stops, but it does not finish. It hangs in the air, a silent alarm that has been ringing for over 15 years, reminding us that in a world of cameras and connectivity, it is still possible for a person to simply vanish. This brings us to the end of our deep dive into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. It is a story that is difficult to tell and even harder to hear, because it reminds us of our own vulnerabilities. We have walked through the timeline, analyzed the suspects, and looked at the evidence, yet the final page remains blank. This case is more than just a true crime story. It is a reflection of how we react to tragedy, how the media shapes our perceptions, and how quickly a life can change. I want to know what you think. Do you believe the investigation into the German suspect will finally bring the answers the family deserves? Or do you think the truth lies in one of the earlier theories we discussed? Please share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. It is important that we keep the conversation respectful and focused on the hope for truth. If you found this analysis compelling and want to see more content like this, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. By keeping this story alive, we ensure that the search for the truth never truly ends. Thank you for watching, and stay safe.